All right. Good evening, everyone. I think we're getting ready to start. So, on behalf of the Russian Studies program and all of the sponsors of tonight's event, definitely welcome to this talk tonight. My name is Olga Mistropova. I'm an associate professor of Russian, and I'm the director of ISU's Russian Studies program. I think you guys are in for a real treat tonight. And tonight's guest of honor is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and writer, Fred Kaplan. Fred has a PhD in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Originally, he is actually from the Midwest. In fact, as I found out today, his mom is actually from Des Moines. He himself is from Kansas. That's where he grew up. He then did his undergraduate work in the Oberlin College. So he definitely has a connection to Midwest. Currently, Fred writes a weekly war stories column for the Slate magazine. You probably read in his bio that he has also written for other publications such as the Boston Globe, the New York Times, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, Time magazine, and Foreign Affairs. Fred is also the author of several books, including his most recent volume entitled Dark Territory: The Secret History of Cyber War. Now, I should also mention that after the talk, two of his books will be for purchase, and Fred will be signing them. So make sure to stay around for a little bit and get his autograph. Another thing I would like to mention is the sponsors of tonight's lecture. Without them, this event really would not have been possible. So here are the sponsors, very long list. The College of Engineering, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Greenlee School of Journalism and Communication, Departments of Computer Science, Electrical and Computer Engineering, Department of History, Department of Political Science, Department of World Languages and Cultures, the International Studies Program, the Russian Studies Program, the World Affairs Series, and the Committee on Lectures funded by student government. Like I said, long list. All this said, please help me welcome Fred Kaplan, whose lecture today is titled Cyber Sabotage: The History and Politics of Russian-American Hacking.
Wow. Well, thank you. This is a very impressive crowd. I guess there really is nothing to do around here. So now some of you might think, excuse me while I just pour a little water. Some of you might think that this is a brand new topic, cyber war, cyber security. In fact, it's as old as the internet itself. It's embedded in the technology. Back in 1967, so 50 years ago, when something called the ARPANET was about to go up, this was the prelude to the internet. It was a military project to allow labs to talk with each other, scientists at labs to share their research. There was a man named Willis Ware. He was the director of the computer science department at the RAND Corporation. He'd worked on some of the first computers with John von Neumann. He was also, though he didn't say much about this at the time, on the scientific advisory board of the National Security Agency. And he wrote a paper, and it was secret at the time, but it's been declassified since. You can look at it. It's fascinating, prescient. And he said, look, there's a problem with this, that once you put information on a network, once it can be shared online, this might have been the first use of the word online, once it was shared online with multiple users from unsecured locations, you're not going to be able to keep secrets anymore. You're creating inherent vulnerabilities. So when I was researching this book, I talked with the guy at DARPA, as it was then called, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and who was supervising this project. I asked him, were you aware of Willis Ware's paper? And he said, oh yeah, sure, I knew Willis. And I said, well, what'd you think of it? And he said, well, I showed it to the members of my team, and I got this confirmed from a couple members of the team, and they said, oh God, don't saddle us with a security requirement. Look how hard it was just to do what we've done. I mean, it's like telling the Wright brothers that their first plane had to carry 20 passengers for 50 miles. Let's take this one step at a time. The Russians won't have anything like this for decades. And it was true. It took 2.5, 3 decades before the Russians had anything. But in the meantime, whole systems and networks had grown up with no provisions for security whatsoever. So I view this as sort of the bitten apple in the digital Garden of Eden. It was there from the beginning. It was part of the technology. If you wanted to get rid of cyber vulnerabilities now, you would have to start all over. And then I'm going to tell you a story, but let me just jump ahead to the year 2013, when there was a report by a panel of the Defense Science Board on cybersecurity as a military factor, the threat. And it concluded that it talked about the inherent fragility of our architecture, the inherent fragility of our architecture. In other words, they were saying, this is vulnerable. There's not much you can do about it. So hearkening back to the Willis Ware paper of nearly a half century earlier, but now, of course, it's spread throughout our entire society. And if you talk to people in the Pentagon now about this problem, I mean, they still talk about ways to make cyber systems more secure, just as, you might protect your house by better locks. But they also realize that, look, if somebody with the resources and wherewithal wants to get in, they're going to get in. They're going to get in. And so what they talk about now, the buzzwords these days are deterrence, detection, and resilience. Deterrence, they haven't really figured out what that means. What are they trying to deter? What kind of attacks? How do you do that? Detection, the idea is, if somebody does get in, make sure that you know it right away. In the commercial enterprises, studies have shown that the average amount of time that an intruder is in a system before the company realizes that is 7 months. So you can steal a lot of stuff in 7 months. And then resilience. If they do get in and cause damage, be able to kick them out and repair the damage very quickly. And so, for example, some ways that the military is reacting is kind of interesting. For example, on ships now, the Navy is training officers to learn to use devices to guide themselves, to navigate by the stars, to use a sextant, like in the 19th century, because, not just in case, because they figure that in a large-size war, the data link to the GPS satellites is going to be disrupted at some point, at least for a while. And everything relies on these GPS satellites, the guidance systems in the accurate missiles, communications, navigation. So if all you had were the GPS and it was out, you wouldn't even know where you were, much less where the bad guys were, much less assuring the accuracy of your missiles. So they're learning how to use sextants. So how did this actually start? So Willis Ware writes this paper in '67, and nobody pays attention to it because it's too hard to pay attention to it. When did it come into the government? Well, I don't know. It's been a long time. Has anybody seen the movie War Games? Okay, well, some of you, Jesus, you ought to go see this movie. It's quite good. So the movie, which came out in 1983, stars Matthew Broderick as this tech whiz teenager who likes to play with computers. And one day he accidentally hacks into the main computer of the North American Defense Command. And thinking that he's glommed onto a new online game called Global Thermonuclear War, almost triggers World War III. Okay, so Ronald Reagan sees this movie in June of 1983. He's up at Camp David for one of his 5-day weekends, watching movies every night, and this was one of them. And so he comes back to Washington, and there's a big meeting on the following Wednesday. And it's all of his national security advisors, some people on the Hill. They're talking about something else completely different. They're not talking about this. But the movie is still on his mind. And at one point, he puts down his index cards, and he looks around. He says, has anybody seen this movie War Games? And nobody'd seen it because it had just come out, like that the previous Friday. So he goes into this big plot summary of what happens, and people are kind of looking around, where's this going? What's he doing? And then he turns to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he says, General, could something like this really happen? Could somebody really just break into one of our most secure computers? And the general says, as generals generally do, I'll look into that, Mr. President. So he comes back a week later and says, Mr. President, the problem is much worse than you think. Because all along there had been this substratum of people, mainly in the NSA, who were aware of this problem. And so in 10 months after this, Reagan signs the first National Security Decision Directive on computer security. It's been declassified since. You can look it up. It's called NSDD 145. And you will find, if you look it up, that it reads exactly the same as many documents and stories that you're reading now. This is in 1984. It warns that our computer systems are becoming increasingly reliable to electronic interference and other forms of tampering by criminals, terrorists, and foreign spies. And it comes up with this conclusion, and it basically decided that security standards for all computers in the United States will be set by a committee, and they make up this name of a committee, and the committee, by the way, will be chaired by the director of the NSA. So there were people on Capitol Hill who didn't much like it and had this quaint notion that the NSA shouldn't be involved in domestic surveillance, and so they did a compromise, and we've been living with it since, and that is that classified information like .mil, military stuff, that will be secured by the NSA. And all other kinds of computer stuff, that will be secured by some branch of the Commerce Department. Well, two things were wrong with this. One, the Commerce Department didn't have the technology or the manpower or the technical skills or anything to do anything about this. In the NSA at the time, if they detected a vulnerability in a system, they weren't interested in breaching it, in fixing it. People all over the world were using these same systems. They were going to exploit it. They were going to hack into it. So for many years after, still, nobody did anything about this problem that Willis Ware detected back in 1967, namely about security. Okay, next big thing that happened was more than a decade later, in 1995, the Oklahoma City bombing. You might remember a big federal office building was blown up in Oklahoma City. Many people killed, hundreds of millions of dollars in damage. President Clinton appointed a blue panel commission to look into how to make federal facilities more vulnerable, less vulnerable, how to protect them from damage. Now, the people going into this commission thought they would be looking at things like bombs, people exploding, dams and things like that. Well, there were a couple of people who got in the staff who were familiar with this cyber problem. And in fact, it was about this time that they started calling it cyber. So by the time this report came out, more than 2/3 of the report, and you can read this now too, is about cybersecurity, something that nobody had even heard about. And they were particularly talking about the vulnerability of what they called critical infrastructure, things without which a modern society can't function. Communications, banking and finance, energy grids, waterways, dams, stuff like this. Because what had happened, without anybody even knowing about it, everybody knows about it now, but about the time the internet really started going, industries decided, this is great, let's put everything up on the net. You get things in the mail like, join our smart grid. Well, what is a smart grid? It means it's a long grid, and there are sensors that detect the movement of electrical power, and if there's a shortage over here and a surplus over there, it'll automatically reroute the power from one place to another, and it saves money on manpower. It's very efficient. It's a great idea. And one thing that nobody knew while they were doing it is that this stuff is vulnerable to hacking. All of it was vulnerable to hacking, and that was the conclusion of this report. Still nothing happened. Why? Because, well, in the United States, all these critical infrastructure companies are owned by private corporations. And they didn't want to go to the trouble because it's very expensive to fix this kind of stuff. Then, right after this Blue Panel Commission, there was another dramatic development, which, again, nobody has really written about until recently because it was all classified. But there was a guy he was a 3-star Air Force general named Ken Minahan, and he had just become the director of the NSA, and he had been the director of something called the Air Force Information Warfare Center, which was very familiar with the vulnerability of computer systems, and he couldn't get anybody interested. I mean, think about this. This is back in 1996, 7. Most people in the military had never used a computer, especially generals. Most people, the president, the secretary of defense, these people had never used a computer. So this seemed like a sideshow. So he decided to do an exercise. And he got this legally approved and everything, that basically a red team in the NSA, 25 hackers, professional elite hackers in the NSA, would hack into the entire Defense Department network. And nobody knew about it, except the Secretary of Defense approved it, some lawyers talked about how to do it, and one of the provisions, for example, was, okay, you guys cannot use your top secret signals intelligence stuff. You've got to use commercially available equipment. You know, you can't hack into Americans, even for this kind of purpose, with your top secret stuff. So they went out and bought some stuff from Radio Shack or whatever, and they did this, and they'd set aside 2 weeks for this exercise to go forth. Within 4 days, they had hacked into everything, including the National Military Command Center, which is the link between the Secretary of Defense and the President of the United States in time of war. In some cases, they just kind of left a marker, like, Kilroy was here. In other cases, they messed with stuff. They intercepted emails, they sent phony emails, they messed with the commanders' heads. This is what information warfare is. It's not just that you're getting information. You're messing with their minds. You're making a commander distrust what he's seeing, what he's hearing, making him uncertain. And almost nobody even knew that this was happening. Because again, there had been no protocols about what to do if you're hacked. There was no Defense Department guidance on this. There was no nothing. The only person who did anything there was one Marine out in the Pacific Command who realized something funny was happening with his computer, and he just unplugged it, which was about all that anybody can do. So there was a briefing of this, and people realized, oh my God, our entire system is vulnerable. What are we going to do? Well, one thing that they did, that they hooked up all the Defense Department, at least in the Pentagon, a bunch of computers. They installed intrusion detection systems, which was a fairly new technology back then. And so they do this, and what happens all of a sudden? They start detecting intrusions. There was one right after this exercise where all of a sudden they noticed that a bunch of military facilities were getting hacked. Somebody was hacking into them. And some of these were deployment centers, and there were things going on in Iraq, so there was some suspicion this might be the Iraqis doing this. Well, turned out to be 2 kids from the California suburbs, okay? Now, some people said, whoo, it's just 2 kids from California. Other people said, oh, Jesus, if 2 kids from California can do this, what can a nation state do? And then, shortly after this, and here's where the topic of the lecture begins, they started detecting more intrusions. These were more serious, though. Whoever was doing this, they weren't just getting into something and getting out. If they couldn't get in at first, they'd try again. And then they'd really explore the site. And when they left the site, they would cover their tracks. They were doing the kinds of things that are now called advanced persistent threats. And they traced it to the Russian Academy of Sciences, the site of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and pretty well conclusively saw this was Russia. Now again, this is 1997, 98. So this is the heyday of the kind of good relations between Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin. This was not the Cold War, and it's not whatever you want to call the relations between the US and Russia now. this was a pretty friendly time. So they decided, let's send over a team to Russia. The name of this exercise was called Moonlight Maze. The one where they tried to uncover who was doing the stuff that turned out to be the California kids was called Solar Sunrise. So Solar Sunrise, Moonlight. One thing, a lot of these operations, they have very cool names. I mean, the exercise from the NSA and the Pentagon was called Eligible Receiver. So this Solar Sunrise, Moonlight Maze. So they go over and they meet with this general, this Russian general, who greets them warmly. And, there's much toasts and caviar and so forth. Then they come to work the next day, and the guy, they brought along some files showing it. And the guy looks at the logs, and I won't use the language in this hall. There might be some sensitive ears, but basically, he started shouting about these guys in the intelligence who were doing this. This is scandalous. We're going to get to the bottom of this. People's heads will roll. So they come, then they're called that night, and they say, no meeting tomorrow. We're going to take you on a sightseeing tour. And then the next day was another sightseeing tour. Long and short of it, they never went to another meeting again. They never saw this general again. They never got anything. So they realized, well, this is serious stuff. So it was beginning to happen. Now I should roll back the clock a little bit. This study that was done for Reagan and that he signed, and it laid out all these ways that our computers were becoming vulnerable. Very early in the course of my research, I showed this document to somebody who was fairly high in the intelligence community, who I knew had worked on the study that went into the document. And he said, and this was confirmed by many people I talked with later, he goes, well, look, here's what you've got to realize. All these scenarios and projections about what somebody might do to us, these are mirror images of what we're doing to other people already. You think about this is what the NSA, now they weren't computers back then, they were phones or radio signals. But even back then computers were hooked up to telephone modems. So it's the same thing. And the whole role of the NSA has always been to intercept foreign communications. So that meant intercepting radio signals, tapping phone lines, this sort of thing. So we had already been doing this for quite a long time. And then at some point, people began to think, this isn't exactly rocket science. I used to say, this isn't exactly brain surgery, but now we know that you don't really have to be very smart to be a brain surgeon. So this isn't exactly rocket science. If we can do it to them, then someday they'll be able to do it to us. And that's when they started to get kind of serious. And again, this is around 1998, 99, about not just the offensive part of this, but about the defensive part of this. Okay, so, there was someone in the Clinton administration who was very keen about this, and he came up with an idea that, maybe we should create a parallel internet for critical infrastructure industries, which would be hooked up to a government agency so that if things started happening, there would be some way to respond. Well, this was leaked and denounced as Orwellian, and all the critical industry infrastructure companies lobbied against it. Secretary of Treasury and Commerce and the Council of Economic Advisors chairman would say, we can't impose these kind of regulations on companies. It will retard their innovation. It will put us in a less competitive spot. And maybe it would have, but it did not. It systematically did not address the problem. And even jumping ahead a little bit, if you look at some of the executive orders that Obama signed, which did some interesting things that hadn't been done before, still, in the middle of the executive order, it said, none of this shall be interpreted as a requirement, as a mandatory requirement. So, you say that, people don't do anything. It's expensive. For example, electrical power. I mean, that's something that a lot of people worry about a lot. If you took out electrical power in a region and they can't, imagine the kind of disaster that this would be for quite a while. And about the same time as the Stuxnet program, which most of you probably know about, but I'll get into it in a little bit. But, during late Bush 2, they did a demonstration out at a government lab in Utah. It was called the Aurora generator test, where they took a gigantic electrical generator, weighed about 2.5 tons, and they did a demonstration to see if you could destroy this generator strictly through cyber means, not through any, wireless, not through anything hooked up by wires, not through a weapon, but whether you messed with the current in a way that just made it explode. And you can go online, do a Google search on Aurora generator test. There is a YouTube video of this thing going up in smoke within about 2 minutes. And that's when people realized, this is serious stuff here. Now, did anybody do anything about it? Well, these critical infrastructure companies, some of them have done quite a lot. For example, banking and finance. Now, why is that? What's the job of a bank? A bank, they need your money, and they also need your trust. I mean, if you're reading a newspaper article every week that your bank just lost another $100 million to a hacker, you're gonna start thinking, maybe I ought to put my money in under my mattress or something, certainly to another bank. And they also had a lot of money, so they were able to hire people who really knew what they were doing. So banks, they still get hacked all the time, and sometimes successfully, but they've also gotten pretty good at detecting this right away and repelling the intruder. And of course, your money is FDIC insured as well, so there's that. Electrical power, on the other hand, they say, well, look, what you're telling me is that I need to spend $10 million to make this generator more secure, but you're also telling me that maybe the bad guys will figure out a way around whatever it is that I've done, and then I have to spend another $10 million? And in the meantime, I've done a calculation which suggests that the cost to me of repairing the damage in the event of an attack is not much more than $10 million anyway, so why should I do this? And your executive order says that I don't have to do it. So that's kind of where we are today. Now, that was focusing on critical infrastructure. And really, again, while some industries have done something, the vulnerability, it's like an arms race. Maybe you're up here, but the offense has gone up here. So the situation really hasn't changed that much. If somebody wanted, say China or Russia or somebody wanted to, turn out the lights in much of the Midwest, they could. Now the question now, see, the saving grace of this is that they've started developing computer-controlled systems as well. So there really is kind of a de facto mutual assured destruction state. If they do it to us, we could also do it to them. In fact, this leads to kind of an interesting point, which when around the late 90s, when all these exercises started happening, the military and the intelligence community started thinking about this in a systematic way. And they usually put acronyms on things. So thinking about the whole problem of cyber, they said, okay, there's CND, Computer Network Defense. That's pretty obvious. You work up ways to defend your computer network. There's CNA, Computer Network Attack. And by the way, that very phrase was classified until just a few years ago, the very fact that we were doing CNA. But then there's also something called CNE, Computer Network Exploitation. And that means literally to exploit the vulnerabilities in an adversary's computer systems. Now, is this offense or is it defense? It might be defense. I mean, you might say to yourself, and you might mean it, okay, we need to get inside this other guy's system so that we can tell if he's about to launch an attack on us. And, makes sense. I mean, it's like, governments have spies that try to insinuate themselves in foreign governments. Well, this is like a digital spy, in another guy's network. But the thing is, it's the same technology as computer network attack. It's the same skill sets, it's the same people doing it, it's the same way in. The only difference is that you haven't taken the final step. You're in the system, you're scoping out the guy's networks. all you haven't done yet is to attack. Maybe you're saying, well, we're just in there for defensive purposes. We're there for intelligence. We're there for espionage. But it would be as if the spy in the government, in the foreign government office, has a mini nuclear weapon in his backpack because he can become a saboteur at a moment's notice. That's why we have this ambiguous situation now. You know, and here I'm going to get into the whole business of the Russians and us today. You know, and the Chinese too. When the Chinese hacked into the Office of Personnel Management's servers and, you know, swiped the records of millions of federal workers, General James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, was asked at a congressional hearing, what are we going to do about this cyber attack by the Chinese? And he said, in a moment of quite refreshing frankness, he said, well, I don't know if this is really an attack. It's more like an act of espionage, similar to things that we do, which was kind of, you know, a lot of people raised their eyebrows. So what about what the Russians are doing these days? Now look, in the past, you know, in the 2008 elections, it was revealed that China was hacking into the websites of the Obama campaign and the McCain campaign. But basically, that was espionage. They wanted to know who these guys were, what their position papers were, who were the important people, where were they going, what were they meeting. You know, that happens all the time. What the Russians were doing in the 2016 campaign and what they are doing now in the campaigns in France and the elections forthcoming in Germany is something a little bit different and crucially different. They are hacking into the various, you know, servers and emails and other things that the campaigns were doing. And by the way, not using really advanced technology. I mean, the Clinton campaign gave up most of the emails through pretty simple phishing operation. You know, somebody sent an email that looked innocuous and there was something to download, and he pushed download, and he downloaded a piece of malware which hauled off all of their email. This isn't, you don't need to be a nation state to do something like that. But then what they did, and you know, I'm not revealing anything new here, this has all been reported about many times, but I'm just drawing the distinction, was that they cherry-picked this intelligence and funneled it back into the United States as part of an information warfare campaign to influence the American election. And they did this. It has now been revealed that they were hacking both the Democratic campaigns, Clinton's campaign and Trump's campaign, the DNC and the RNC. But you haven't seen any of the stuff from the Trump campaign or the RNC. They had a goal. The goal was to, if not help, there's some debate still. Was their intention to help elect Trump? Or did they assume that Clinton would be elected, but that they were trying to make her government as illegitimate as possible, as distrusted as possible once she got in? And is there much difference between those two things? So this is part of a vast information warfare campaign that included not just the hacking, but also, you know, the hundreds or thousands of fake news sites, some of which have been generated from people in the pay of the Russian intelligence service, as we now know. And the ultimate intent is to basically disrupt relations between the United States and Europe, fracture the European Union. I mean, it's no accident, comrade, no coincidence, comrades, that the EU is now very weak, that countries in Europe are electing people who have no affinity for the EU, who want to get rid of the EU. There were Russian-sponsored campaigns in the Brexit campaign. They're now trying to get Marine Le Pen elected in France, who is a big admirer of Putin and wants France to split away from the EU. For a while, this was Trump's motive too. We don't quite know what Trump's motive is now because he has lots of different advisors who take lots of different positions on these things, and we don't know which of them Jared Kushner has been listening to most recently. So it's still an unknown thing. But the point is, now what makes us different? Because in the past, and this is no secret either, the United States and the Soviet Union, as it was called back then, frequently tried to influence the elections of other countries, small countries. I mean, there's been reports of this is standard knowledge now, but the CIA would funnel money to anti-communist parties in Greece, in Italy, shortly after World War II. What happened in Chile in the 70s, the Soviets doing the same. One big difference, and this sounds a little crude, but let's face it, it's true, is that this time it's happening to us. And it's happening on these cyber networks that we have known about for 50 years, or that some people have known about for 50 years, are inherently vulnerable. And that it has been generally known for at least a decade, 15 years, by just about everybody. I mean, look, you're all here because you've been reading stories about this. And yet, nothing has been done, really, to cure this problem. Part of that is because there is no cure. But part of it is also because, look, this one person told me he was Assistant Secretary of Defense with a portfolio that included cybersecurity in the Obama administration. And early on, he was called into the office because, well, there's been a security breach. Somebody fell for a phishing expedition, where you click to download and you download malware. And he goes, oh, God, how stupid people are. Well, it turned out it was him. He fell for the phishing expedition. And I'm sure that everybody in this room probably has fallen for some form of phishing expedition. I did once. I don't know if anything happened, but you get a note and it sounds very panicked. And I better see what's going on here. And the next thing you know, you're downloading malware, and who knows what happens to that malware. When I was working on this book, people would ask me, well, what do you do about your computer security? And I said, well, there are things that you can do. Look, most people who are coming after your stuff, they don't care about you. They're just trolling. I mean, it's kind of like what some people described the Soviets during the Cold War. These are like hotel thieves. They go around, they try a door, see if it's locked. If it's locked, they move on to the next door. They go in if it's unlocked. They're not going to spend a lot of time, getting into your Netflix account or something like that. They're not interested in your passwords. But if you have something that someone really wants and values, and especially if it's a nation state that wants what you have, there is, as I said about this business of the Defense Science Board study of the inherent fragility of our architecture, there's really nothing you can do about it. They're going to get in. And so the things that you probably ought to think about are detection of this and what to do about it. Now, this is about to get much worse because, everybody here know about the Internet of Things? Whether you know it or not, you're buying devices that are hooked up to networks. If you have a smart TV, if you have a smart thermostat, if you have a car that was built in the last couple of years, there's computer networks in these things. There was an experiment done a couple years ago. It was sponsored by ARPA. Somebody took a Jeep Cherokee and basically figured out a way to hack into it remotely, strictly on computer. So it could have been done from anywhere in the world. Because what happens in a modern car, and again, this is all for the best intentions, it's to make life more convenient. You don't want to learn how to parallel park? You push a button, the car parallel parks by itself. Now, how does it do this? It has a sensor that measures the distance between your car and the other car, the distance between your car and the curb, and it's processing all this. If you think something's wrong with your car, but you don't have time to take it to the garage, there's online diagnostics. How does this happen? Your whole car sends out signals to the to the service center of whatever car you have. It's not just Jeep Cherokee. And they look at it and say, oh yeah, you've got you need a new carburetor or something. Come on in. They type you a message. So they figured out how to get into this. And some guy went out on the road with a car, and people hacked into it, and everything about this car was commandeered. The steering wheel, the brakes, the accelerator pedal. If somebody had wanted to assassinate this person, it wouldn't have been that difficult to do. Drone strikes, they're pretty good. There's something way up there, but at least there's a crater at the end of it. Well, must have been a drone strike here. In this case, it's like, well, cops come along and they say, well, he obviously lost control of the vehicle. I'm not trying to make everybody paranoid here, but this is what's happening. And here's something else that's happening. If you don't care about, nobody has any, it's true. Nobody cares about hacking into your car and making you drive into a tree. This probably is not going to happen. But here's what is happening. There's stuff in your houses, baby monitors, refrigerators, which, let the delivery service know when you're out of milk, these are little computers. You don't know that they're computers, but they're in there. Now, there's no way that you can get into them because there's no user interface. They actually come with a password, but, it's stuff like password or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you can't even get in to change the password. What's happening recently is that somebody, and it doesn't even have to be a nation state, hacks into hundreds of thousands of these devices, and there are hundreds of millions out in the world now. And they kind of, it's like amassing an army of robots. They're bots, and they amass hundreds of thousands of them, and with a push of a button, all of them send a signal to some network, overloads the circuits, and the network crashes. This happened last year with a company in New Hampshire, which is kind of like an operator exchange for many internet channels. And for several hours one day, it wasn't terribly harmful, but stuff like Twitter and Netflix and Spotify and these things just shut down. And it had all the appearances of a test run. Because, this time they aimed it at Twitter and Spotify, but maybe next time they'll aim it at the computer system that controls a power grid or something else. The point is that without even your knowing about it, we are all filling our house with stuff that can be recruited for a bot attack on a computer network. The mistake that was made 30 years ago by critical infrastructure companies, which said, well, this is very convenient, this is very cool, let's hook up all of our stuff to the internet, and therefore they created all these vulnerabilities, is now being replicated in all of our homes. So look, I'm not suggesting that we all go back to the caves. I mean, this stuff is happening. There's really probably nothing to be done about it. But I think we can get smart about it, to use a phrase. For example, and maybe we're too late to do this, but somebody suggested this to me. There was a guy, his name is Matt DeVoe. He now runs a very high-powered cybersecurity company, but he foresaw all of this in 1996 in an article which he titled, "Information Terrorism, Can You Trust Your Toaster?" It's kind of what we come down to. And he said, well, look, how about passing a law, and maybe, I don't know, write letters to your congressman or something. Pass a law which says no Internet of Things device can be activated until you change the password. Because how did this guy hack into all these Internet of Things back then? Well, there's a program that basically intercepts, or that gloms onto and hacks into and decodes 60 passwords. And these are basic passwords. Again, you probably have some passwords like this yourself, or used to. Password, A, B, C, D, E, F, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And these Internet of Things devices have these kinds of passwords. So simply by throwing this virus out into the world, he was encoding the passwords of all these things. So if all of these things had passwords that were a little more complicated, it wouldn't be able to latch onto them too much. And just a simple thing like that might make an enormous difference. But again, it requires, if a company, if there were two things out at the store, you wanted to get a smart thermostat, and one of them didn't have this feature, and one of them did, and the one that did cost $2.50 more, you'd probably buy the cheaper one, because you say, oh, what does anybody care about hacking into my thermostat? Well, they don't care, but you saw Mr. Robot, probably the scene where the woman with the smart home, the hackers get into it and turn the heat up and down and turn the stereo up and down and make everything flood. Yeah, that could happen too, but that's not the danger. The danger is that we're all turning our houses into bot armies. So basically, and then I'm going to turn this over into questions and answers. We all have to become better citizens about this, because the companies aren't going to do them themselves unless there's a demand for these kinds of things. We have to become more aware of this kind of stuff. I mean, it's appalling that, 20 years into the computer revolution, something like an intrusion detection system, why isn't something like this commonly available in every version of Microsoft Windows that you buy? How come it's not a feature? Why are they leaving it out? Microsoft in particular is very sensitive about this. Every time, you get these software updates, here, click on here to close some gaps that have formed to make it. Do that right away, because it really is because they've spotted something, and this is a way to repair it. But why shouldn't we have something that tells us that our own computer is being intruded? So the point is this. This is the world that we are stuck with. It's the world that Willis Ware predicted in 1967, sorry, and that's been accelerating ever since. It is now becoming politicized. It's becoming part of our everyday lives and also a tool of international politics. Since this is partly sponsored by the Russian department, let's be clear about this. Russia is not a strong country. Their military isn't very good. It has no global reach. The only deployment that it has outside of Russia is in a thin strip of Ukraine plus Crimea and a base in Syria, which it's had for decades. Its economic system isn't anything that anyone in the world emulates. They have no appeal. Putin has tried to recreate an Eastern Bloc version of the EU. It failed. He's tried to create alliances with China. China isn't interested. But what he's very good at doing, maybe because he studied jiu-jitsu, is he exploits the weakness of the West. He can't do certain things that he would like to do. He would like to restore the old Soviet Union. He can't do that as long as the West is unified. So what he's trying to do is to shatter the unity of the West. Hillary Clinton lost the election for a lot of reasons, most of them self-inflicted. But the election was so close that you could say that any one of these reasons was crucial. And one of these reasons was a very successful information warfare campaign launched by Russia through WikiLeaks and other useful idiots or abetting partners. The same thing is happening in France. The same thing is happening in Germany. Everybody sees it while it's going on in real time. And yet, despite the awareness of this universe for decades, nobody is doing anything about it. The institutions aren't even there to do much about it. In the meantime, I'm going to say one more thing. One thing that has happened in the last 8 years is the United States set up something called U.S. Cyber Command. This is our new offensive branch of cyber war. They've now declassified. They talk openly. They don't talk about specific operations, although I do in my book, but they acknowledge that there are these offensive operations. They are attached to every combatant command that we have around the world. They look at target sets. They say, oh, well, you want to destroy this target maybe? We can do that through cyber means instead of bombs. It's there. It's part of the planning. It's a big bureaucracy. It's one of the fastest growing things in the Defense Department. It's co-located with the National Security Agency at Fort Meade. Right now, although this is about to change, it's directed by the same four-star admiral who is the director of the NSA. It's an elaborate thing, and yet, really, they don't know what they're doing. Nobody has thought through the strategy of this. Nobody knows what cyber deterrence is. You know, what is the government responsible for if a bank is hacked? Should that be any concern of the government or the military? What about 3 banks? What about 6 banks? What about a corporation? What about a power plant? You know, the very first time that an American president went on TV and I denounced and identified the origins of a cyber attack and said that he would be taking retaliatory measures at a time and in a manner of his speaking, it was when North Korea hacked into Sony Pictures. I don't think anybody saw that one coming. So what is crucial? What is something that's crucial to our survival, crucial to our values? And then what do you do about it? You know, with a nuclear weapon, you know, this is the thing. Back when Hiroshima and Nagasaki went off at the end of World War II, there were people without any security clearances at all, economists, social scientists. They started thinking very seriously about this new weapon in our midst. Is it something brand new? Or is it just a big version of weapons that already exist? Is it something that you can wage war with? Or is it something that's completely different? And if it is completely different, I guess what we have to do is figure out how to deter anybody else from using it. And how do you do that? And they talked about this, and there were essays and books written within months of the explosion, which had enduring influence, that still influence nuclear strategy today. Why is that? Well, there were some things about nuclear weapons that were classified, but you know, there was film footage. You saw what it does. It was revealed in an official government document that it had something to do with uranium. There were documents showing the dispersion of uranium mines around the world. You could infer who might be able to build a bomb and how many of them. And you could make some calculations about what's a rational strategy on the basis of that. Until very, very, very recently, everything about cyber stuff was so classified, was embedded in the most secretive government institutions in the whole country. I mean, the joke in the 1970s about the NSA is that the initials stood for no such agency. Everything about it was secret. And so people of a strategic bent who might have been interested in thinking about these problems didn't know enough about it to even know what were the relevant questions. And if they did, there wasn't like, you know, outreach to civilians. There was nothing like, you know, the dozens of think tanks that dealt with nuclear weapons or conventional war thinking about these problems. So that's another thing that's come up, and it's recent, and I think we all as citizens have to grasp this, is we now know something about these things, and we should be forcing a dialogue, because we have a war machine. It's not just an intelligence system. It is, and I'm not even using the word war machine pejoratively. Countries have war machines. You know, sometimes you have to go to war. This has become a tool of war. Every war that's been happening in the last 15 years involving the United States or Russia or China has a cyber dimension to it. So, but nobody has thought through these issues. Nobody knows what you do after a massive cyber attack, how you repair the damage, and then what you do about it. Do you launch back at what? You know, if North Korea launches a cyber attack, you know, they've got about 1,000 servers in the entire country, 1,000 IP addresses in the entire country, all hooked up to one server in China. If you destroyed that, you would be doing nothing to the country because it's all offline, basically. So we are basically 50 years after Willis Ware's study at about the same point that we were with nuclear weapons at about 1948. And while there are a lot of studies on this now, they aren't very helpful. And so more people, I know there are some engineers in this audience, some policy students in the audience. If you're interested in this, then there's a lot that you can do to get involved in it, to make yourself more familiar with what's going on. And maybe you can help. It can't really be solved, but can more successfully manage this problem for our economy, for our everyday lives, and for national security in the future. Thanks very much. So, I think there are microphones to the side, I'm told. Any questions? Come on, got to be some questions, no?
Yeah, I have a question.
Oh.
Sure. You talked about deterrence, and I was wondering about your opinion or evaluation of the role of, say, individual citizens who want to go out and, like be a patriotic activist or something, and kind of not go crazy, but kind of take matters into your own hands a little bit in the name of self-defense.
You mean just to, so you're asking the droves.
Sorry.
You're not asking about national deterrence, but just deterrence on an everyday level to keep people from.
What you think it's okay for individuals to do in the name of protecting not just maybe themselves and their own security, but their companies and their country more broadly?
Well, I mean, yourselves, there are things online. One of my colleagues at Slate did a whole series about personal cybersecurity, two-stage authentication, things like this, changing your passwords periodically, using randomized passwords, because it's amazing. You might think that nobody can, you're calling your password, Penny 498 because your first dog was Penny and your address was 498, and you figure that, well, nobody's going to get that. There are devices called password busters that they can basically throw an entire dictionary with variations at a system in a matter of seconds. So, if you go to some of these password managers, something in the cloud that manages all of your passwords, and the password is QX75 *! 3, that kind of thing. That's a good idea. You're not going to remember it, but the manager in the sky will remember it. And yeah, maybe the manager in the sky might get vulnerable too, but it's better than your own stuff right now. And then just, some of it is just smart. If somebody rings your doorbell and says, hi, I'm selling, my car broke down the street, and can I use your telephone? You're not going to let them in. Well, the same thing. If somebody sends you something and it's got something to download and you've never heard of this person before, or, if somebody is pretending to be a bill collector or Amazon or the IRS, and they're a vaguely anonymous note asking you about, or telling you about a refund that you're owed or a gargantuan bill that you owe, they're not going to contact you on your email. Just think. Part of this is just think. And then, as I say, phone calls to congressmen actually, there are a lot of congressmen, they might be interested in this issue, but if they don't think anybody else is, they're not going to go to the trouble. Every congressman has a long list of issues. And if they see that 10 people have called them in the last year about cybersecurity, it's probably not going to be one of them. If they see that 500 people have called them, then maybe they'll say, geez, maybe I ought to get educated about this a little bit.
Well, my question about individual action,
Yeah.
My mic wasn't on at first, so maybe you didn't hear the whole thing. It was more about hacktivism, like people who go out, take down WikiLeaks, take down jihadi sites, hack the Russian Foreign
Oh.
Ministry, that kind of thing.
You mean individuals?
Yes. What's sort of your
Well,
opinion
you know,
of
there
that?
there are some companies which have very sophisticated cyber specialists working for them. I mean, some of them used to work for the NSA and agencies like them, and they're getting hacked all the time, and the government isn't helping them. And so they're saying, well, we ought to be able to retaliate ourselves. And they have the means to do this, and they have technically competent people who can do this. But the problem is, I mean, this is like vigilantism. You know, let's say you're in a town and it's a corrupt police force, and your houses are getting broken into, and the cops just aren't getting it done. They're not finding the bad guys. Well, you know, you could set up searchlights and detectors yourself, and then, I don't know, go shoot the people who are doing it or something. I mean, you know, it's a tempting thing. There have been movies about this. But it's not really a way to keep order in society. But you're right. I mean, there are a lot of companies that are very frustrated by this and are at wit's end on how to do about it, which means, you know, and again, the people who are really good at this in the government are working mainly at places like the NSA, which is prohibited by law from doing things like that to domestic people. And you know, they really do, by and large, respect these laws. So I'm not saying that therefore let the NSA come into our homes. No, that's not a good idea either. But the government itself, supposedly the Department of Homeland Security is empowered to do this kind of thing. But, you know, it's a very dysfunctional agency. Good people come in and they get frustrated and they leave and they go someplace else. It's probably a terrible idea to have made this thing, which was, you know, bringing together 22 different functions from 8 different departments to form one agency in which nobody is really running things. So, yeah, the government it's a dysfunctional system. There's a problem that's been recognized for a long time, and yet the system seems incapable of dealing with it. And you know, the activism might be to, you know, I mean, look at who sits on the committees that have some oversight on this, or talk to candidates about it, and, you know, make them respond to your questions. What are you doing about this? You know, there's this problem. What are we doing about this? Again, it sounds lame and feeble, but that's how some serious efforts have begun.
Thank you.
Sure.
With respect to the problems the North Koreans are having with their missiles, do you
Yeah.
think it's their ineptitude or a foreign government is interfering?
Well, there was an article in the New York Times a few weeks ago, which you probably know about, by the same reporter who unearthed the Stuxnet plan to disrupt Iran's nuclear program, which claimed that U.S. intelligence agencies have hacked into, it was very vague, it had been lawyered, this article. So it was a little bit vague, but it talked about, they were able to hack into something about the command systems of the test sites. And so my guess is that some of it probably is, but one thing that was stated in that article was that it's impossible to know whether that was what was stopping these. I mean, the North Koreans have something like an 85% failure rate on their missile tests. Now, if there were no hacking, I suspect the number might be just a little bit lower. I mean, they're doing this on their own. They have no help. The military, and especially the nuclear side of the military, is treated a lot better than the average North Korean citizen, but it's not like, you know, they set up special universities for them. I mean, they had terrible technical training. They don't have very good technology. All of their missiles are liquid fuel missiles. They're very unstable. And again, they got some nuclear designs from Pakistan, and there's some indication of there might have been some back and forth trading between those two. But it's one thing to have a blueprint. It's another to have actual scientists come in and help you do this. So I'm not saying they're entirely a paper tiger, but they're not a very, their growl is worse than their bite, let's say. If North Korea were the most, I mean, the serious threat about North Korea is because they are so weak. And they're run by this guy who really, you know, I mean, his father and his grandfather, who used to run North Korea, I mean, they weren't exactly nice guys either, but other diplomats had figured out a kind of a game plan that they had, and they were able to play into that game plan. I mean, for example, very few people write this, but the agreement that Bill Clinton made with the North Koreans to stop their plutonium program actually worked. Now, it was a limited program, and they were in the meantime secretly building an enriched uranium program over on the side. But there was a way of dealing diplomatically with those guys. This guy, you know, I've talked with real specialists on Korea, and this guy is just a mystery. I mean, it takes a certain kind of mentality. I mean, there have been a couple of his enemies, self-declared enemies, that he's executed, including a relative, by firing a surface-to-air missile at him. There is turning the surface-to-air, something that's been designed to go up 8,000 feet and blow up an airplane. They aim at the guy, maybe 50 feet away, I guess with the idea of obliterating him. I mean, so that there's not even a fingernail left of this guy, just wiping out everything about him, nothing to bury. But this, you know, this takes a certain kind of derangement. So it's very difficult to know what to do about this. But in terms of, I suspect there are cyber programs, but I suspect they're very limited because there isn't that much that's hooked up to a network in North Korea. So, you know, hats off if they were able to figure out how to break in at some point, but I suspect it wasn't an enduring intrusion. But I don't know anything for fact here. You know, that's just an inference.
Good evening. Thanks for being here.
Sure, thank you.
I have a question. On January 5, 2017, there was a briefing at Congress by directors of the national security teams.
Mm-hmm.
One of the senators in the briefing mentioned a research that was done by a group at Carnegie Mellon University.
Wait, at where?
At Carnegie Mellon University. They said that since 1945, the United States has participated in the changing of at least 85 or 81 governments around the world. That includes coup.
Mm-hmm.
My question then is, does the United States make big deals of something that itself is engaged in? Also, is WikiLeaks a bad entity for telling people what is really happening in the world?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, let me deal with your second question first about WikiLeaks, because I've followed that pretty carefully. In the beginning, WikiLeaks was pretty much what it said it was. They were interested in freeing information, revealing secrets about all countries, really. At some point, and I don't remember when this was, I should have looked it up before this, but at one point they were about to leak some stuff from the Russian government, and a visit was paid, and that was stopped. There were some people who left WikiLeaks soon after that because one of its leaders, who was a good friend of Julian Assange, his name was, another thing I should have looked up, Israel Shamir, who was Belarusian, was seen carting off raw intelligence data that they found to the Belarusian Interior Ministry. That's when some people started to leave. I think the conclusion is inescapable. This has been stated by CIA director and others, and I don't necessarily agree with everything that the CIA director says, but I think at this point it's indisputable that WikiLeaks is now basically an arm, or at least a converging, a better, of a hostile intelligence agency, hostile to the United States and its Western allies, and often in the service of the Russians. Julian Assange, I don't think this show is still on, but he had a show on RT, on Russia television, for which he was paid handsomely. He's given speeches to the Russian government. He has never leaked a single document that's critical of Russia. He has leaked only documents critical of the United States and specifically its intelligence allies. So I think WikiLeaks, and this is a problem that newspaper and media editors are just now coming to grips with. They'd get a stash of stuff from WikiLeaks, and it was just too juicy to resist, and it was news. So let's print it. But they're now beginning to realize, well, wait a minute, if we got similar information from, openly a foreign intelligence agency, and there was nothing in this information that, what was reported things that were illegal or harmful to the Americans that was going on. Should we be abettors of this? Should we be their enablers? I mean, it's a tough question. And how do you draw the line? As for the United States' involvement in overthrowing other countries, I mean, since the 1970s, when there were Senate hearings on malfeasance in the CIA and NSA, it's been well known that this has been going on, that we do it, and the Soviet Union has done it as well. And there is a school of thought, and I agree with it. I think Putin, whether or not it's true, I think Putin genuinely believes that, like the Orange Revolution in Ukraine was masterminded by the CIA, that other efforts to overthrow allies of his were all, the Green Revolution, the Orange Revolution, all the colored revolutions. This was a plot to overthrow Russian influence. Russian leaders have often felt a sense of encirclement, sometimes legitimately, sometimes it's just paranoia. But I think he sincerely believes this, and and this was also one of the conclusions in the briefing that you're talking about, that part of Putin's campaign against Hillary Clinton was revenge. That Bill Clinton had openly, one of his policies after the end of the Cold War was the enlargement of NATO, having countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact and right up against the Russian border join NATO. And he thinks that Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, had something to do with fomenting the street demonstrations against Russian control of Ukraine and pushing for the Ukraine to join the European Union. I think he seriously believes this, and some of this information warfare, I think he probably genuinely sees as giving us a taste of our own medicine. Again, I doubt that this really was a CIA plot. I don't discard the possibility that some U.S. officials had something to do with encouraging it. But given Putin's background as a KGB officer, and given his statement that the implosion of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, I think that he's inclined to do this. Look, I think it's very hard to do any kind of dealings with Russia these days, and I'm certainly no apologist for anything that Putin has done. But the United States and Russia do have converging interests on some things: terrorism, nuclear nonproliferation. And it would be a good idea at some point, although the question is on whose terms and under what conditions, that some kind of cooperation between the two countries can be revived, and that maybe part of this conclusion is that we don't mess around with each other's internal political systems. Yes.
How can foreign hackers who know very little about the U.S. political system influence the results of the election if Hillary's team, that's full of experts, could not? And if you talked a little bit about...
Wait, I'm sorry, can you speak into the microphone?
Sure.
Yeah.
How can foreign hackers who know very little about the U.S. political system influence the results of the election if Hillary's team, that's full of experts, cannot?
Well, that's good. Well, first of all, there are a lot of people in Russia and China in particular who know quite a lot about the American political system. You don't need to be the equivalent of a Kremlinologist. It's all pretty open. It's out there. If you want to push some buttons, I mean, psychologically, these people, they're well known. There are someone like Hillary Clinton and even more Donald Trump are pretty easy to read. You kind of know what's going to appeal to them, what's going to set them off. Showing, it's well known what people's stereotypes about Hillary Clinton were, that she's cold, that she has no principles, that she, is very secretive, that she's in the pocket of Wall Street, whatever. And there's data that you can amass, assuming that you just hammer those points of data, that seem to confirm these things. My concern about Donald Trump right now is that I'd say every foreign leader in the world is coming to the conclusion that if I have a talk with this guy and I'm very respectful and treat him like a world leader, I can put him in my pocket. I mean, look, 3 months ago, China was raping our country. Now Xi is a terrific individual, just a terrific guy. We've had hours and hours of conversations. He doesn't have any, right now, I'm drifting from topic a little bit, but I will take the prerogative to do this. Trump has not nominated even a single under or assistant secretary of state or defense. Some of his people, the secretary of defense, his national security advisor, these are smart guys, but they've never been involved in policy. He has nobody briefing him on policy. He wanted to know something about China. He went to his son-in-law and said, here are my views about China. Do some research to confirm this. And he goes to Amazon and he finds a book by some guy who's written a book called Death by China, and that's who he appoints as his trade negotiator. I mean, this is a hell of a way to run a government. So, you look at, if I'm a foreign intelligence officer and I'm looking at Trump's interactions with foreign leaders, I say, okay, I know how to talk to this guy now, so it's going to be in our interest. She has a 10-minute conversation with him about why it's difficult for China to press North Korea. He says, oh, yeah, it's very interesting. Gee, I hadn't thought it's very complicated. It's more complicated than I thought it was. More complicated than anybody thought it was. So, is Xi now going to give him a lecture on the South China Sea about why China should have exclusive rights to what's going on there? Maybe. He's not getting any counter briefings from U.S. officials who have expertise in this. Back to your question. The point is, there's plenty that foreign people can know about the United States and do. There are specialists, just as there are specialists, although the evidence has to be a lot more inferential, about Russian politics, about Chinese politics, about Saudi Arabia politics. This president is going into this with a very unbalanced situation. As for why didn't Hillary figure this out, this is a problem. This is a person who has never been a very good campaigner. She made the same mistakes this time that she did in 2008, even though with different staffers. She hired people who were infatuated with big data and looked at the data, didn't have any background. Experienced politicians like her husband, Joe Biden, local congressmen and mayors who would say, hey, you've really got to come out here to Wisconsin. You've got a problem here. Or people going into a campaign office in Michigan and saying, I'd like 15 campaign lawn signs. They say, oh, we've decided that lawn signs really don't have any effect, which is nuts to anybody who's driven through a neighborhood and seen one Trump lawn sign after another. These things have an impact. So yeah, she's a lousy politician. Okay, she still lost. She still won the popular vote by 3 million. And lost 3 crucial states by less than 1% of the vote. But yeah, it's kind of apples and oranges, the questions. Yeah, the Russians can know a lot, and Jesus, why do you know? I just saw Lynn Nottage's play. Have you read about this, called Sweat, about these steelworkers who lose their plant in Pennsylvania? And I'm watching this, and I'm saying, how come Lynn Nottage knows about this and Hillary Clinton didn't? It's a very good question. But it's more about Hillary Clinton than Lynn Nottage. So your question is more about Hillary Clinton than the Russians, who are behaving like, standard intelligence agencies or standard nation states with an adversarial interest about another country, and therefore they study it and act on their studies, which is what the United States used to do until quite recently.
All right. I have a quick question. Well, it might be quick. Earlier, you alluded to the fact that WikiLeaks and other solo groups may have a sort of agenda or political allegiance with a certain foreign government. So my question for you is, with the rise and fall of cyber activist groups like Cult of the Dead Cow in the 90s, Loft in the early 2000s, Anonymous and LulzSec in recent decades, where do you draw the line between ethical hacktivism and acts of treason?
Well, I never accused WikiLeaks of treason. Part of it, he's not an American citizen, so I don't know if he can be accused of treason, but maybe espionage. It's very interesting. He makes a very interesting point. The Loft, which I write about in my book a fair amount, it's a very interesting group. One of the guys who headed Loft, who went by the name Mudge, Peter Zatko, in fact, went to work for DARPA for a while and funded the experiment showing that Jeep Cherokee and other cars like that were vulnerable for the purpose of educating car manufacturers and others, like, hey, you've got a problem here, and I'm going to demonstrate the problem. There was a kind of a funny thing that happened in the late 90s. You can look this up on YouTube. Mudge and the entire Loft group testified before a Senate committee on cybersecurity. And they all used their pseudonyms, not their real names. And at the time, Zatko had long hair. He kind of looked like Jesus. And they were taken seriously by the few people who attended it. It is, I guess, one way you draw the line is, what are they doing with this information? Are they handing stuff out to foreign intelligence agents or to criminals, or using it to try to tilt the American political system in a clearly, in a clearly unequivocal way, or are they using it to enlighten people about, hey, this is a problem? When the Loft existed, the FBI, the NSA, the CIA, other agencies, they had Mudge come out and give them lectures. They knew what the vulnerabilities were, but they said, hey, this is a good idea. Maybe he'll turn us on to certain things that we haven't discovered. And Mudge always cooperated with them, never charged them a fee, because he figured quite a lot of what he was doing was on the borderline of legality. And if he was ever arrested for doing some of the things he was doing, it would be a good idea to be able to call as his character witnesses the director of the nation's leading intelligence and national and law enforcement agencies. So it's a very good question, and one that a lot of people are dealing with, but I think there are certain lines that are crossed on the bad and good side of this that make the intentions clear. It used to be a long time ago, or actually not that long ago, that the only people who could do this kind of thing worked in places like the NSA and their foreign counterparts and the Air Force Information Warfare Center. As the technology has proliferated, as in many ways commercial devices have kept pace, in some ways outpaced the top secret SIGINT stuff, this talent has spread. There are a lot of people who can do these things now. And, for example, some companies, most companies have bounty rewards. Find a vulnerability in our system that nobody else has found, and we'll give you $100,000. And so a lot of companies have sprung up. The Amazon, the Apple FBI thing. That was discovered by, okay, hey, we've come up with a way to do this. So, yeah, there's money out there. Companies, and there's a lot of people who used to work in the elite hacker divisions of the NSA and places like that still have the talents. And so this is going to happen, and used in a certain way, it's a very good thing. But yeah, it's kind of amazing. I find it kind of amazing that there aren't more black sheep like this who have used it for nefarious ends. But yeah, you can tell whether they're good or bad by what they do with it, and that is fairly detectable. But hacker is no longer an unequivocally nasty word in national security enterprises and bureaucracies, as it once was, because they understand that, well, these people, if they're so inclined, can help us. Anybody else? Up over here, sorry.
I just have a quick question for you. Hacking, anything like this is a very technical field. Do you have any technical background, or is it all from a sort of historical, political standpoint?
You mean like studied in college or something, or?
Just,
Yeah. No, I'm not very technical. Like if you were a computer scientist and you wanted to sit down with me and go over some stuff, you would very quickly discover the limits of my knowledge in that field. I had to learn a fair amount so that I could write this book. The book is not really a very technical book. It's mainly a narrative. But I had to understand some technical things to write about it. But no, I make no pretenses at being a computer engineer, a computer scientist, somebody who can design or really even understand a lot about software. I think there aren't very many people who do both, which is why most books, I don't know what you, but if you're a computer scientist and you've read books about hacking, it might be stuff that is written by people who can't really write in plain English. And there might be some people writing about this in plain English who don't really understand or completely misunderstand the technology. I guess I'm trying to come at both, but I'll admit to you that I'm far more on the historical, strategic. I mean, one thing that I did for this book, I interviewed about 100 people, including 6 NSA directors, all on background, but many of them were quite frank. But that's where I got most of my own education on this, is from the people who actually do it. And then, of course, testing it with people who know the stuff but aren't so wrapped up with the bureaucracy, just to make sure I wasn't being hosed. But yeah, I write about foreign policy, national security politics. My books have been in that dimension as well. So yeah, it's more history, strategy, with enough understanding of how it works so that I don't. My goal in a lot of what I write is that if you don't know much about what I'm writing about, that you'll at least have a basic understanding of it. And if you do know quite a lot about what I'm writing about, that I won't seem like an idiot. So that's the median point that I'm aiming for. I wasn't looking over here, so let me just take over here, and then I'll go back to you.
One more question.
Okay?
Okay.
Yes.
So, as someone who does have a technical cyber background, what can my friends and I in cyber do to get our point across to those who are less technical without coming across as one, alarmist, or having our cries fall on deaf ears?
Or having what?
Having our concerns
Fall on deaf ears?
Yeah.
No, it's a tough one. It's a tough one. Again, there are enough, I hate to keep coming back to it, but there are people in Congress who understand this more now, at least staffers. I would say, the people who know best about what you can do on a nitty-gritty level are people like you, who also read the newspaper or something, and maybe get together in groups and discuss, well, what can we do about this? Because I don't think there's been, because it's all been so wrapped up in classified information, you know, until recently, the people who know this stuff really can't get together and talk about it. Now, there's enough out there that you can, and, you know, maybe make an agenda. I find that these kinds of solution answers sound very lame, but we really are still at a very early stage of this, even though it's a problem that's been recognized for a half a century. So I guess you start where the basic things are. Yes.
No question here. No questions. I was just going to say, okay, let's thank Mr. Kaplan for a wonderful talk.
That's